The better we understand the context, the smarter we are. The world is not changing towards our personal status quo.
Right.
Uncertainty is a bigger challenge for us psychologically and mentally than fear is.
Put us in the minds of a flexible leader, the way you're describing it in the book. Like, how do they think? How do they reason?
The approach of a flexible leader has three parts. Intention plus context plus flexors. That we're most influential when we have a balance of strength and warmth.
Kevin, it is such a pleasure to have you back on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well, it's been a day or two
Yeah.
since I was on before, and I'm super glad to be back.
Yeah, you came on in 2019, right before the pandemic, and we talked about long distance leadership, and that was a great episode. And I was joking, like you had the foresight that a global pandemic was going to happen and change the way leaders had to lead. So that was an awesome episode, and I'm glad to have you back because you got a new book.
Yep.
It's called Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. It's out March 25th, and we're going to cover a lot of good stuff in the book. It's very meaty, and we're not going to be able to cover everything, but let's start with the introduction. So you talk about how everything seems to be changing about leadership, yet the most important things aren't changing at all. Talk about those things that are unchanged about leadership, the fundamentals that are just core to leadership, and why they matter in a world that's moving so fast and so uncertain in a lot of ways.
Part of the reason they matter so much is because the way most people want to think about change is, if it's changing, then everything's changing. And what we need to do is be clear about what's not changing. Let's take a very simple example. Like, you've got a process in your organization or with your team that you want to change, and it's a 12-step process, and you're going to fundamentally change 4 of those steps, and they're going to all be redone. And what most people do is say, well, we got to change all this stuff. But really, it's 4 out of 8 or 4 out of 12, I guess is what I said, right? So 8 steps aren't changing. And if you just start by saying that to everybody, then it's like,
yeah.
4 are still going to change, and they may be a lot, and they may be the biggest 4, and all that stuff can be true. But so much focus is placed on the stuff that's changing that we don't stop. You know, when we had that conversation in 2019, we said in Long Distance Leader, both in that version and in the book, that the version, second edition that came out last fall, think leadership first, location second, which is another way of saying what I'm saying now in this new book, which is more is the same than is different. And let's be clear about that. So what is the same? Human nature is the same, right? Human beings who are amazing and wonderful and full of potential and messy, like that's the same. Group dynamics are the same. How people come to the decision about whether they're going to make a change or not hasn't changed. Like, there's so much about the core of leading. What goal setting ought to look like fundamentally hasn't changed. The fact that goals are useful hasn't changed. We could go on and on about what's the same. But what's different is context. And when we understand better the context in which we're living and working and leading, then we can be far more effective moving forward, right? I often say that, like, the better we understand the context, the smarter we are.
You talked about all the attributes that leaders have. You think that flexibility is going to be, if not now, at the top of the list of the attributes that are needed for a very successful leader going forward. Why do you believe that?
Well, I believe that because in a world that is uncertain, and there's no doubt that there's a lot of uncertainty, that the best antidote for uncertainty is flexibility, right? To be able to adjust and flex in the face of uncertainty is the critical skill that can help us navigate the uncertainty. And so pretty much everyone's going to agree that, man, there's a lot of uncertainty. Maybe there's more than ever. I'm not sure how we can actually judge that because we've not lived it any other time. But we can certainly say there's lots of it at all levels, right? Sort of geopolitically, societally, community-wise, like the work itself-wise, like all these, there's all this uncertainty. And let's just think about it this way. If I were leading 5 years ago, if I were leading in a certain way and I was leading, let's say I was 80% of my potential. I'm just making this up. Like I was I was 80% as good of a leader as was possible for me to be 5 years ago. And the world has changed. Stuff has changed. Context has changed in those 5 years. But I haven't. What are the odds that I'm as effective or more effective than I was 5 years ago? Like very low. Like the world is not changing towards our personal status quo.
Right.
It's just not. Like the odds of that being true are like less than zero. Right. So that means that we probably weren't happy with 80% then. And so if we haven't moved, we're below 80% now. So again, I'm just picking a number, right? So if we're not willing to adjust, able to adjust, aware that we need to adjust, then we can't possibly be getting more effective. And again, we already said a lot of the stuff is the same. It's this, but knowing what's different, being aware of what we can flex becomes the critical skill for us as leaders.
I imagine with having that flexibility attribute, it probably helps. We already talked about uncertainty, but like fear and anxiety that come as a manifestation of that uncertainty within our people, as well as just being a leader. Like the flexibility probably is an antidote to that.
I believe that it is. In fact, I was leading a webinar just like an hour ago before you and I are having this conversation. And I asked the group this question, which is worse, fear or uncertainty? And like 95% of the people said fear. And that I could walk you through the research that would say that ultimately uncertainty is a bigger challenge for us psychologically and mentally than fear is. Here's the thing about fear. Like if there's a rabid dog in your neighborhood and you can see it, you're fearful of the dog. And you want to make sure the dog doesn't get you. But if the dog is now gone and you know the dog has been captured, the fear is
right
gone. But if you can't see the dog, but don't know the dog's been captured, like you still have anxiety. You're still worried. You still are stressed. And so anxiety, uncertainty has no bound. And so if we can say, well, there's an end here, then that's quite different. And quite honestly, in many of our cases, that's not where we're at. Right. So we think about uncertainty being a tough situation, and it can be. It causes all sorts of ripple effects for us psychologically and on our teams. So we've got to look for the antidote. And I believe that antidote is being able to be flexible and help our teams then be flexible and being willing to try stuff, because we're not going to be able to pick perfect best practices in a world of uncertainty and complexity.
In your book, didn't you highlight a study about, was it like some sort of shock therapy where it was like, there was like 20 constant shocks and people knew from that group they were going to be shocked a certain level that many times, but then there was another group that had 17 a certain level, but then 3 were just going to out of nowhere maybe shock you at a different level. And hopefully I'm not butchering that.
Yeah, well, so here's how it goes. People were in one of two groups. Daniel Ellsberg is the study. You're in one of two groups, and you go in knowing you're going to be shocked 20 times. And the shocks will either be strong or moderate. And one group gets 20 strong shocks, and the other group gets 17 strong shocks and 3 moderate shocks that are intermittently randomly put in amongst the 20. Which group had higher stress? The one that actually had some shocks that were less, because they didn't know. Like, so yes, that, like hopefully we don't have to go get shocked to figure that out, but it's true. Like we will choose the thing that gives us certainty, even if it's more painful. That's a big point to think about. It
is. It's huge. In the book, there's a great quote that I wanted to pull out. It says, "Action overcomes fear. And with action, we have the starting point of competence, because we can't get good at anything until we try it." End quote. How does action...
Hey, did I say that? That's pretty good.
You said that. It's very profound, I thought. And I pulled that out because I'm like, there's such a good nugget in there, because so many people are paralyzed by inaction and they won't do anything. But action starts this loop of confidence and competence, as you outlined in the book. Describe that and how it just gets us going.
So let's just think about this. So we call it the confidence-competence loop, right? If you have a level of confidence in something, you probably will get better at it. right? Like we sort of know that. And we also know that if we show some advancement or skill advancement, competence growth, then what happens to our confidence? It goes up. So if we have a level of confidence, I'm not talking about naivety, but even that,
Right.
like because if we have enough confidence to say, I think I can figure this out, then we'll try. And if we try, we'll learn something and maybe we'll get better. And if we get better, then the next time we're a little more confident, which spurs the confidence. It's like a flywheel. And if we can get it started, and you can start it from either spot, right? But the place that we don't think about as much is confidence. And that's an important lesson for us as leaders, for ourselves, to get better at this complex thing called leading. But it's a human fact, right? And so how do we do that for ourselves as well as for our teams is a critical skill for us to consider as leaders. And I just don't even think we think about it enough, talk about it enough.
No, yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. You highlight a concept called sense making. I'd never heard of this before. Like, how do we make sense of a world so we can act in it? And we were talking about taking action. So like, how do we make sense of the world around us to take action? How do leaders use this framework of sense making to be proactive, to take action with themselves, their people, instead of being reactive and sitting on their hands?
So I borrowed this from the great work of Dave Snowden, and it's a model called the Kevin framework. And the idea, and it's most often used for like bigger picture things, right? Like looking at big situations, large organizations, big changes, and that sort of stuff. And I'm encouraging us to think about this as leaders in a more personal, individualized, with our team sort of way. And basically what it is for us, Brandon, is a map. Like if I put you out in the wilderness and say, I just want you to get out, what you most want first is a map. Okay, like where am I? And that'll give me an idea of how to move. And so what this map does is gives us the context of the world that we're in or the situation that we're in. And given that context, we can make different or better choices. Because otherwise, all we'll do is what we're used to, what our natural response is, what our habit is, what we've been told our leadership style is, and we're not considering context. We're just saying, oh, this pattern recognition says, oh, then do this. This is a situation I see, I should do this. And what I'm suggesting is that our world being more complicated, more complex, more uncertain, that the situations are far less often clear, which is one of the 4 parts of the Kevin framework, that it's where it's clear and the knowns are known and we can know where to go and we generally know what cause and effect is, and people can look to someone who knows something, and that might be us as a leader, and make a decision, and we have best practices, and we tend to treat most everything that way when that's a relatively small part of the world in which we work and live. And much more of the world that we work and live in is what we would call complicated, or what the model would call complicated or complex, where there's either some things we don't know and we know that, or there's a whole lot of things that are unknown and we don't, and that's when we often get stuck. Or we just plow through by going back and assuming that we can just go by a best practice. This is how I've always done it. We'll just do it like that. And then we have all these dominoes that fall and we wonder why they fell. And later we look at it and we say, well, that's why. Because the context was not what we thought it was. But we never stopped to look at the map before we started. Just because things aren't known doesn't mean there isn't a map. And the Kevin framework gives us a map that we can start to use.
Put us in the minds of a flexible leader, the way you're describing it in the book. Like, how do they think? How do they reason? And are there tools for the rest of us who want to become that flexible leader to think more clearly, build those skills more quickly to become that flexible leader?
So I say in the book that the approach of a flexible leader has 3 parts. And we've hinted at a couple of them already. Intention plus context, which we were just talking about, plus flexors. So the first thing a flexible leader does is to recognize that my natural inclination, habits, and auto response might not be the best response. Maybe not. I should at least check to see if the context tells me I can go with my natural response or not. That's the first thing. And then if I think it's not optimum or my best option, then it's like, how do I flex? So it's about the flexors, right? So let me give you an example of a flexor. An example of a flexor is that leadership is about outcomes and others. That's my definition. Leadership is about reaching valuable outcomes with and through others. So there's the flexor. Are we leaning towards outcomes or are we leaning towards others, the people? And all of us probably know leaders that probably are on one side of that or the other. Like they're all about the outcome. They're all about the result, 100%. The people be damned, so to speak, right? Like, yeah, I got people, but like they've got to get in line with this outcome. That's one end. The other end is, well, I got to take care of the folks. If I don't take care of the folks, how are we going to ever get to the outcomes? And I would suggest to you, and these flexors say to us, that most people would say, I got to pick.
Yeah.
Is it about outcomes or is it about others? And I would suggest, and the flexible leadership mindset says, no, it's not either or, it's both and. That every situation is about both of those things. And now it's not, which end of this continuum am I on? Because I would propose to you that most of the time, being at the far ends of the spectrum are never the right answer. That the better answers are somewhere in between, managing the tension between them, being able to hold both of those things in our mind at the same time, and then making decisions in a both and world. And so sometimes we need to be leaning more toward outcome, and sometimes we need to lean more towards others. Let's take the start of the pandemic. Most organizations, many leaders that never really thought this way before, started leaning a little more towards the others, at least for a while. Like, we got to, like, this is a problem. We got to lean in that direction. And people were saying, and I worked with them every day, and we got to get the work out, but we really got to take care of the folks. And so they were living that flexor, that tension on that particular dynamic. And you can think about any kind of context in your work and say, well, given that, which direction should I be leaning? Right? If you've got a major project, and maybe as we're closing that out, like my team is very focused on us launching this book successfully. Right now, that's where we're at. Right? That's where our focus is. And so I'm probably leaning a little more toward outcome in relationship to that right now than I might all the time. And yet I know that we can't be accelerating at 100%. We can't have the accelerator to the floor all the time. And yet some leaders, that's where they are. Well, like, it's about the outcome. We got to we got to reach the quarterly number.
Right.
And you want to keep your best performers, right? And you don't want to lose them just because you know what I'm saying. And so that's one. In the book, I believe there are 19 flexors. And I actually believe that a flexible leader starts to see lots of things as a flexor and saying, okay, what's the tension that I need to be saying? What's the both and that's in play here? And so if we can be intentional enough to slow down and ask ourselves that question based on our context, that's when we're leading flexible.
I want to get into the intention a little bit, because I think so many of us have these automatic thinking, these patterns, these responses that are just ingrained in us. But if we stop and actually are intentional, there's probably some ways to interrupt those patterns that we're used to. How do we be aware of those patterns so we can actually then use the flexor that you're describing to know where we need to be on that spectrum?
Well, so what you and I have both insinuated now, but we haven't said out loud that I need to say, and that is that I'm challenging people by taking a flexible leadership approach. I'm suggesting that it's going to be harder than what you already do, because what you already do now is aided by your habit.
Yeah.
And our habits are automatic. So we just go do them, right? And maybe we have to go redo them 5 times because it didn't work, but we don't have to stop and think. So the first piece of intention is recognizing that maybe I ought to stop and at least take a breath first, right? So the first part of intention is just being aware that intentionality is valuable. And then it's a matter of reminding ourselves. And I believe that actually, once we get that mindset that says the world is both and, not either or, and the world requires me to at least consider options other than my natural response. Like if you can get to that mindset, then the other two become easier, right? Getting someone to practice thinking about context and practicing flexors without having that mindset is not going to happen. It's just not going to work. If the mindset doesn't match the rest, we're done. Right. There's no sense in even continuing the conversation, right? Which is part of the problem with most training, because most training goes right into skill. It doesn't really talk about the why enough, and it doesn't talk about the why in terms of what do our beliefs need to be, what does our mindset need to be in order for us to even accept the skill beyond intellectually.
I think it's why like the context part of this equation is really important, because I think so many people, like, their intentions are built into them. They have this patterns and responses already like predetermined. And in the context, they're not even stopping and pausing to see what situation's right in front of them. They're just going through it with their own beliefs, their own lens.
Because this is my style. This is the way I lead. This is what I do. They have to adapt to me because I'm the boss.
Right. In the book, you explore how leaders could identify whether a situation is clear, complicated, complex, or chaotic. Now, many leaders, if they haven't read your book, are probably not going to sit and look at the situation with those four components. But how would this work in a decision-making process, any situation that we're faced with? How do we diagnose each situation correctly so we know how to move forward? Well,
that takes us back to the Kevin framework that we were talking about, right? And the four pieces of that map are a clear context, a complicated context, a complex context, or a chaotic complex. And we don't have time to unpack it all. And besides, Brandon, they need to go buy the book, right?
You're right.
But let me give you a couple of big picture ideas, everybody, in all seriousness. A couple of big picture ideas. And I've already said one of these things is that most of us tend to act as if most contexts are clear, which means the knowns are known, the cause and effect is obvious, and we should just move from there. And so we either believe that to be true or our natural inclination leads us to that point and we just move. And I think it's pretty clear that most of the time that's not the case, right? And the other thing we assume is, well, it's just chaos. It's just chaos, right? And in chaos, quite honestly, in the model, if we're truly in a place that's chaos, where let's just imagine that you're running a plant in Houston, Texas, and a hurricane is coming. Well, if you've ever been around a hurricane or even just watched the Weather Channel, you know that they don't know exactly when it's going to hit, exactly where it's going to hit, and what it's going to mean, and where it's going to mean to it's truly chaos. The unknowns are unknowable. Like, we don't know. But we know we need to be doing something in preparation. And once it hits, we got a whole bunch of other things we got to be doing something about. And in those moments of true chaos, what your team wants is for you to just make a decision and so we can move. And so guess what? We treat more situations as chaotic than truly are. And we treat way more situations as clear than they really are. And in both of those cases, us making a unilateral decision are actually often really useful. But we end up taking that same approach when that's almost the opposite of what we should be doing. Right. So without us being able to unpack all of it, I would just say that we tend to lean too often into assuming that a best practice is all we need. And the way we've done it is going to continue to work and follow the procedure, and that'll be fine. And in a world that's changing, best practices rarely are.
Yeah.
Because the context is off. Right. Because the context.
I think you mentioned earlier in the book, you outlined like 19 flexors, and there's several chapters, one of which is big picture and then everyday flexors. There is one that I want to pull out because I think it when we're talking about this, like leaders being on one side of the spectrum or the other, the strength versus warmth flexor was interesting to me, because too often we look at leaders, they're like, wow, that's a really strong leader, or that leader is really warm and fuzzy. But we can be both, can't we? Like, how can we look at that flexor and put this to a real world example and flex it along the spectrum? How would that work?
So let's just talk about that for a second, right? So again, the flexor is strength and warmth, right? And so The research in this particular area around influence says that we're most influential when we have a balance of strength and warmth, right? We can make a list of leaders that we say, hey, those are really strong leaders. Margaret Thatcher, right? Donald Trump. This isn't about whether you like them or their policies.
Right.
Like, it's pretty clear that his approach is one of coming from a place of strength. You don't have to, again, you don't have to agree with him or like him, right? And then we have other leaders who we might think of coming from the warmth side, Mother Teresa, Oprah, Jimmy Carter. I would say George W. Bush, more on that side. His dad, almost for sure, on that side. And again, I'm just picking people that maybe you can immediately hook to here, that probably are on the ends, on the extremes. And the point here, like we've been saying all along, Brandon, is that the extremes, while useful, have blind spots. And again, whether you voted for President Trump or not is irrelevant to this. Please don't let that get in the way of this conversation, right? Seriously, like, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. I mean, it's irrelevant because you can see that his strength is useful, and it sometimes is a blind side. And so, and quite honestly, some of the things you read about the man in a one-on-one situation show him to be far to the other side of that spectrum. Right. And yet that's not what he exhibits in public most of the time. And so I would actually argue that probably he has a balance of it, although his persona doesn't say that. And so that's actually probably useful for us as leaders. So I'll give you another example. The public persona of President Obama is probably more on the warmth side. But you read about the people that worked with him in the White House, and they say, not so fast, much more on the other side, right? So I'm not picking a party here, and I'm not, and that's not the point that I'm making. The point I'm making is that, and if you become the president of the United States, you had to be highly influential, and you have to have a lot of great leadership qualities, regardless of your policies. We're not talking about that. We're talking about your ability to lead others and get others to follow you. You have to have a tremendous amount of skills there. And I've just given you two examples who, on a persona perspective, probably on opposite ends. But the reality is they're probably much more in the middle most of the time.
Yeah.
And and then it's, what's the context of this situation? Tell me. Where do I need to lean right now? And being able to intelligently use context to help us decide that, rather than doing what we like or value ourselves or comes naturally to us, becomes the key.
What I love about your book is you highlight the need to flex in any given situation. And you remind us in the book that leadership's complex, hard to put our arms around, even with a great model. And I think so many people pick up a book, they take a framework and a model, and they want to implement it. And then they're so rigid about how they're approaching any decision with this framework. You're arguing the opposite, really. It's to be flexible, to look at every situation as a unique one. So how do we?
I'm doing that. That's exactly what I'm doing. In fact, we hinted this a little bit that, I've been in this world of helping leaders get better for 30 years. And so, sort of really, we've had people really working on this in a serious way for 100 years, right? So amazingly how much of that percentage of the time I've been involved in it. But the point that I'm trying to make is a lot of people a lot smarter than me spend a lot of time building models, building approaches, building styles. And the importance of a style is it helps us get our arms around the complex, because we're taking something called human behavior and leadership that's really complex, and we're creating a model to simplify it enough so we can put our arms around it. That's awesome. The unintended consequence is that leaders do exactly what you said. They take that thing that they can get their arms around, and then they codify that, and then they say, this is my strength. This is the kind of leader that I am. And so we take something that's already simplified, and we simplify it further. We lose all nuance and all chance for complexity and flexibility. And so that's why I say leadership styles and strengths are helpful until they're not. And they're not when we take them as our identity. That's when they're not. And too often, that's what actually happens.
If organizations, or people listening to this podcast episode is like, I need to go back to my leaders and create some more flexibility within these leaders, help develop that attribute. What are some like initial steps that organizations can take to really develop their leaders in this, the way you're talking about in the book?
Yeah, I go back to where we started, which is the first piece is intention, right? Help people understand that the world isn't just black and white, and help them recognize and acknowledge the uncertainty, recognize and acknowledge the complexity, and recognize that means it can't just be either or, but it needs to be both and. If we could get leaders and that not only is both and better, and flexibility is the antidote to uncertainty, and not just that, but to even accept that being flexible doesn't mean being wishy-washy, right? And that flexibility isn't the opposite of stable and steady. They're not the opposites. They're on attention too. Both are true. We need to be consistent and solid and stable on our values and on our principles and on our mission in the organization. Like, that stuff needs to be rock solid. But how we lead, the approach that we take, needs to be flexible. If we can get our leaders to buy into and see and understand that, then I, of course, believe that the context stuff and all the other, and the flexors will help us move beyond that. But if you don't get that first part, as we said earlier, Brandon, if we don't get the mindset part right, you got no shot. So if I was doing this organizationally, those would be the conversations I'd be having first.
You concluded the book saying that flexible leader becoming one starts with choices that they make. What choices do you hope that leaders who are listening to this podcast or have bought your book by the time this is out, what do you hope the choices they make are initially?
First choice I hope that you make is to realize that you can be a more effective leader, that you are not yet the leader you were born to be. And secondly, to make the choice to say, the way I've done it up until now, even with good intentions, is not optimal. I can get better. Like, I can get better. I believe I want to get better. And then the third choice is that I'm going to look at context more than leaning into my natural response. And if you will make those initial choices, your trajectory will be up and to the right. Not every day. It'll be rocky. It won't be perfect, right? But directionally, the same way you want your 401k to be, up and to the right.
Kevin, your book is Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. It's out as of March 25th, 2025, and available probably everywhere, I imagine. Where's the best place to connect with you or follow your future work?
If you can spell my name, and you can see it here, or you'll be in the show notes, Kevin Eikenberry, you can find me anywhere, LinkedIn, all the other places like that. KevinEikenberry.com is our website. KevinEikenberry.com/flexible will get you to stuff about the book. I'll say two other things. Number one is, if you're ready to buy a book, don't just buy one, buy two, because we'll give you some free bonuses if you do that. So if you go to KevinEikenberry.com/buy2, the number 2, we'll give you the chance to get some other stuff that will help you. And why 2? Because then you can have someone else go alongside with you, and you can hold each other accountable, help each other grow as leaders. That's the first thing. But even if you're not ready to buy something yet, I have a gift for you. And I'm so glad, Brandon, that you mentioned the confidence stuff earlier, because I created from this very seat and with this very camera, a couple of years ago, a masterclass on confidence, that how to help us build our confidence as leaders and build the confidence of those around us. We sell it every day for $79, but because you were listening to or watching Brandon and I, it's free. So if you go to KevinEikenberry.com/gift, you can get that masterclass on confidence. I hope you'll take advantage of that. And that page has some more stuff about the book too, but I hope you'll take advantage of the gift. Hope you'll buy a book. And I hope you'll reach out to me on LinkedIn or somewhere else and let us know that this was useful to you. and find out how we can help you more.
My guest today has been Kevin Eikenberry. Thanks for being part of the show again.
It's been such a pleasure. It's always fun to talk about important things. It's even more fun when you can do it with someone that is well prepared, asks great questions, and is super engaging. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Kevin.